Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is the Raptor, and we haven't run out of versus matchups yet, so I guess we gotta keep this series going. You guys know the drill. If you want to help choose the ideas for this series, check the video description below to learn how, but you can also click the join button below to become a channel member and directly submit your own matchup for this channel's Ballot Banters. The second episode is up now if you want to see what that's all about, and as always, thank you to all the members for greatly supporting this channel. It means a ton. But enough talk. Let's get to even more talking, I guess. First on the list, Ghostface versus Kevin McAllister, Scream versus Home Alone. This has been an infamous matchup idea ever since that one Death Battle cast episode, or maybe even earlier. I'm not fully up to date on this matchup's history, but what I do know for sure is that there are people out there that love it. In some instances, it seems like it's because they only like the different stuff, and there are people out there that hate it because it quote-unquote doesn't work. And I feel like not all of these stances are very productive as far as talking about the matchup, so I'm gonna try to give some nuance to this concept. To me, this matchup is actually very similar to something like Light versus Columbo. Not in the sense of the kinds of characters that are involved or the tone or anything, but in the kind of matchup that it is. This is one of those matchups where it focuses more on the interaction than the connections. It's not really about what the characters have in common, it's more about putting them in a situation that they are most familiar with and would naturally be opposed to one another, like Ghostface mirroring one of the bandits and Kevin mirroring a potential Scream victim. And it is also less about a fight, like a literal physical fight, and more about answering a specific question. Like in Light versus Columbo's case, that's, can Columbo solve the Kira case? In this case, it's more like, can Ghostface reach Kevin and survive, withstand, or avoid Kevin's traps in the process, that kind of thing. And in that sense, I do have to admit that this matchup does heavily go against the normal death battle rules. Like, it's to the point where it's really not a literal death battle, even if the confrontation ends in death, because it's a death battle. The confrontation still needs to be a battle, and if it doesn't really work in a one-on-one random encounter with basically no prep time kind of situation, then this just isn't that. It's doing its own thing. But some of you may be asking, wait, aren't they doing Light versus Columbo though? And the answer is yes, as a bonus episode, or some kind of extra thing, whatever they decide to end up calling it. And they're presumably doing this to change the rules and the presentation of the production to whatever they want, to whatever best fits that matchup. And if you ask me, this is how all matchups that fall into this general category should be done, because a regular death battle episode may not be the best way to most accurately and most faithfully represent a confrontation. Now, we still need to be able to recognize when something is a normal death battle and when something's not. And if you ask me, Ghostface versus Kevin doesn't really fall into that formula. It's its own separate thing with its own separate primary question. Again, even if the confrontation does end in death, But if you give it a bonus episode and you do whatever the hell you want with it, then I think it works a lot better. And I think we have a really interesting question on our hands. Now, do I think this is something Death Battle would actually do? Well, it probably depends on how experimental they want to get. Light vs. Columbo is basically just being done because it's a passion project for Liam and maybe some other people on the crew, but I could see that leading to other kinds of setups for death battles, and if they do take my approach where they reserve this kind of thing for bonus episodes, then how many of those do they want to do? Because usually those are just done for sponsorships, but who knows? They may do more of them just on their own, but probably not all that frequently. That would be my guess. Next up, Doctor Doom versus Vecna, Marvel versus Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people recognize this as one of the major pitched matchups from the Kickstarter. It was actually in my most wanted death battle pitched episodes video, so that probably gives you a decent idea already of what I think about this matchup. Doom has been a favorite villain of mine across all of Marvel, and basically across all of fiction, honestly, for essentially my whole life. And I actually learned about Vecna through one of my university friends who is really into D&D, and that was before anything with Stranger Things happened. Don't try telling me that's not the right version of Vecna. I know it's not. not. I'm not stupid. I'm just trying to give you some extra context for me, okay? That's it. But yeah, simply put, I warmed up to this idea very, very quickly. To me, this is such a strong example of perfect theme-based connections. This could be a one-of-a-kind epic visual presentation and tone building off of that idea, and that could bleed into the build-up and choreography with these characters' powers in the animation, because there is so much to work with what these characters can do. And I know there are going to be some people saying, this matchup is one-sided, but honestly, even if it is, there is a worthy discussion to be had here if you know D&D, and honestly, even if you don't and just want to learn more about the series, because it's not just trying to anticipate what Death Battle is going to say based on what you already know, it's also about learning new things, and this matchup would be great for that on the D&D side. But even though this episode would definitely need a big D&D focus, at least information-wise, I think it would be difficult for them to bring up major stuff for Dr. Doom that they haven't really covered before. Because even though I haven't loved either of his previous episodes, they did go over a lot of his abilities and character and motivations or whatnot, and yes, they could always focus on the newer stuff in the comics or hone in on more specific stories that they haven't talked about before, but I feel like this is always a challenge when it comes to a character being used on Death Battle too much, and that's why I'm usually not over the moon when a character is getting a third episode, basically any character. But even though I do hold to it that Doom has been through his most popular opponents or most obvious opponents at this point, I feel like this is the one remaining opponent for Doom that feels interesting enough and different enough to be worthwhile and would hopefully give him a really amazing episode. And thankfully, I do think it has a good chance for happening, particularly within the next couple years if it does happen, because it would be a great way to capitalize on both the next Avengers movies and somewhat Stranger Things as well, I guess. It's probably the only way we would get D&D on the show, at least at the moment, if I'm being honest, but this matchup does fall in that sweet spot where it would make a lot of sense and it would turn a lot of heads, so I am pretty hopeful for it happening somewhat soon. Moving on, Neapolitan versus Himiko Toga, RWBY versus My Hero Academia. I actually first learned about this matchup from the thumbnail contest that happened on our Discord server from last year. Before it was selected to be a contest, I didn't even know about this matchup's existence. And once I made it a post on my YouTube community tab for the winner of that contest, there were a lot of people that seemed to be pleasantly surprised by the idea, because it wasn't that popular back then, but some people seemed to like it. Now it's gotten a little more popular, and with me being more familiar with both of these series, I can say that, yeah, it's alright. Not amazing, but I think it's perfectly alright. I definitely think the obsessive or one-sided relationship aspect of these characters is essential when trying to create matchups for them, especially Toga, so I'm happy this matchup utilizes that in a pretty decent way. I think it would also be really easy for Death Battle to write introspective analyses about how these characters are feeling and what those feelings really mean. I think they're actually really good at that kind of writing these days, so I'd be really excited for that. And that could feed into the dialogue and the emotion of the animation a little bit if they find that appropriate enough. It may not be as flashy of a fight as some other matchups with characters from these series, but it could still be well choreographed and have a very fun personality. I would also be perfectly fine with this debate, if only for the fact that we wouldn't be using yet another top tier My Hero Academia character so soon, where the power difference is quote unquote no contest yet again, and kind of just has to dictate everything about the outcome. This would allow there to be a bit more emphasis on stuff like experience, skill, and also their specific abilities, because they do have some unique ones that could make the outcome a bit more unpredictable than you would think. And yes, it would be cool to see where they scale specifically, that would be very cool, but it would also be nice to see Death Battle focus more on their arcs, again, their relationships, the people they know, and just their sides of their worlds. I think that would allow this episode to stand out a lot more from the other ones. I could see this episode happening, but it definitely wouldn't attract as big a crowd as using the main people from these series. I think that's pretty obvious. I would also imagine them waiting a little longer to use another My Hero Academia episode, but not that long necessarily, because it's still a very popular series, and Death Battle's not going to prioritize RWBY as much as they did before when they were under Rooster Teeth, but I don't think they're going to be avoiding it either. They're just going to be using the matchups they want to use with that series when they want to do them. So, I don't know, but it's always possible. After that, Rimuru Tempest versus Kirby. That time I got reincarnated as a slime versus Nintendo. Now, Now, I've talked about matchups for both of these characters before, and I was kind of mixed on both of them to say the least. Granted, I'm still not super familiar with Rimuru, just like I wasn't very familiar with him back then, but I guess we have to bring both of these characters back to try again. And I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but while I wouldn't call this matchup perfect either, it does manage to interest me like a decent amount more, I guess I would say. To get the negatives out of the way first, I think the weakest part of this matchup is definitely the connections, and don't get me wrong, that is a pretty major negative, but the thing is, I think that goes for a lot of Kirby matchups actually. They have very surface level stuff in that regard, just in different flavors, so you're kind of picking and choosing what you want at that point. And there is an annoying quote-unquote debatability to this matchup in the sense of all the Kirby fans seem to think that Kirby completely washes, and all the Rimuru fans seem to think he completely washes, so it is annoying, but at least it is something that can get a larger conversation going, as opposed to some matchups where it feels like no conversation is even needed at all. And at the very least, it could be a very cool comparison of their specific powers and how they differ, and also just be an absolute showcase of absurdity. Because if you don't know these guys at all, holy shit, you would not believe some of the stuff that they can do. But of course, I think we all know the best thing about this matchup is the animation potential. It could strike that balance of being really funny, but also really epic, just being a really fun time to watch these characters fighting. And while usually that's not enough on its own to make me really excited for a matchup, like I said, I do think this one does have some redeemable qualities outside of that. It has a lot of charm, and I do think it is a relatively better option for both of them. I know a lot of people like Mario versus Kirby, and I'm definitely more familiar with Mario than Rimuru, a lot more, but I don't know, I still kind of see Mario versus Kirby as a weaker version of Mario versus Sonic. And as someone who wouldn't be opposed to seeing a Mario versus Sonic 3 in the future, I think this offers something slightly more unique for Kirby. Maybe I could be convinced Rimuru technically has someone better. I would need to look deeper into that. As far as the likelihood, I have no idea what Death Battle thinks about this matchup, and like I said, there are other choices for Kirby, not just Mario, but also Ditto. That matchup seems to be making a bit of a comeback now, at least for some people. They could do this one if they really wanted Rimuru on the show, because I think in a vacuum, out of all the characters that Rimuru could fight, Kirby is just the most popular of those characters. And the Kirby series can likely return, but how are they going to do that? Is it really going to be Kirby again, or will they want to pivot to Meta Knight or someone else? I don't know, so maybe, maybe not. Up next, Vilgax versus Ridley, Ben 10 versus Metroid. This was the matchup that won our fan-made Champions Island event, so congratulations to it for that. And clearly that means some people like it, but I know there are also others that are against it in favor of other opponents for them. And I don't feel as strongly one way or the other, but I think I lean more towards the latter opinion, because I'm definitely more interested in these characters coming to Death Battle than this actual matchup, if that makes any sense. For one thing, this is a matchup where you can definitely find better connections and better debates elsewhere, which kind of just makes it look worse. Not even to say those aspects are awful in a vacuum, but they're also not necessarily up to par with what I would hope for in my Death Battle matchups. There's also not many parallels between these characters that would be fun to play off of in the animation or the analyses. Nothing really that justifies to me why these characters are meant to be paired together in this way, but zooming out a bit, I still think it vibes decently well and has a consistent tone when pairing them together, and it would be fun to see them interact with each other and kind of try to out-evil each other. Yes, that goes for a lot of true villain fights, but it would work really well here. So no, I would not call this a fully well-rounded matchup, but it does have some good qualities and can succeed as a Death Battle production. Based on these guys' other matchups, I think this is like a mid to decent level idea for Ridley, and maybe an above average one for Vilgax. Really, I just want Ridley to show up on the show. I think he's a great character. He's my most wanted Metroid character for it. And as far as Ben 10 goes, really, Gwen versus Eve is the one I want the most. That's the one I'm really holding out hope for. So I don't hate this matchup, and I've seen way worse ones that have gained similar levels of popularity. I'm just not in love with it either. It's acceptable. I think that's the best way I can put it. And honestly, I think the reason why I am more accepting of this idea than some people is because I think this is the most likely option for both characters as far as what Death Battle would do. It got the Death Battle cast episode for one thing, but it's also just the easiest way to bring on these two guys that a lot of people want to see come to Death Battle, despite maybe not not liking the matchup itself. I think Megatron and Vile would be my next guesses for Vilgax and Ridley respectively, but I think in a grander sense, the numbers kind of just favor this one, so yeah, I think this is the one we are going to get. Moving on, Flowey the Flower versus Princess the Princess, Undertale versus Slay the Princess. This is another one of those matchups that got really popular after it was pitched and got its corresponding cast episode, and it was in my honorable mentions for my most wanted death battle pitched episodes video because I knew about it and I was interested in it, but I didn't know enough about it to say whether or not I liked it for sure. But of course, I had to look more into it as an indie matchup advocator and an advocator for just more different kinds of matchups in general, and after seeing what it's all about, damn, this matchup has the potential for some of the wildest written animation and analyses I think we have ever seen on this show. To get this out of the way first, since I'm sure there are going to be some people wondering, I do generally prefer this over Flowey versus Monica because this seems like a more literal fight that you can really make an animation out of, and I think stuff like that is way more important than just choosing a character's opponent based on how much you like them or like their series. I'm probably in the minority when I say that, but that's just how I feel. I think this strikes a much better balance of working as a fight, but also having a really distinct feel and look to it. And the whole experience, I think, could be very thought-provoking, not just in the complex themes that these characters share and bring to the table, but also in their respective gameplay mechanics. What would realistically happen here? How would it work? Granted, I do think most of these interpretations still point towards one character winning, like one specific verdict, but at least that means that the matchup is analyzable in the first place, and it's not so vague to the point where you can't really rule it. So at the end of the day, as long as Death Battle can create an animation that is both entertaining to watch, but also very true to how these characters operate respectively, I think it could kick ass and give us something to remember for a really long time. And I think the true escalation in this battle is not necessarily these characters' power, but the scariness. I think they really need to play that up as the fight goes on. And as far as comparing it to other Undertale matchups, I certainly like this a lot more than basically any of Frisk's matchups, and probably also a bit more than Sans versus the Judge at this moment. I just think it's really solid all around and could be the most unique. And given what Death Battle themselves also think about this idea, I do think this would be Flowey's matchup if he gets on to Death Battle. I don't think we can expect that every single major Undertale character is going to get on, considering they haven't even done one Undertale episode yet, but he was on Champions Island and is one of the most recognizable parts of that series, so I think he does have a good chance. And Undertale can certainly carry the popularity of the matchup without having to rely on Doki Doki Literature Club as well, unless Death Battle actually turns out to like Flowey versus Monica more, but again, based on what I've seen, I don't believe that to be the case. After that, Shulk versus Lightning, Xenoblade Chronicles versus Final Fantasy. This one has been such a mainstay in the hardcore versus community for such a long time. It's never really been the most hotly anticipated matchup of all time at any given time, but it's never really fallen off either. It's something that a lot of people consistently like to talk about and get excited at the thought of. And this is probably the matchup in this video I have the least to say about because it seems like most everyone likes it, and honestly, I do too. It's really as simple as that, and it's certainly a hell of a lot better than something like Shulk versus Cloud, which if you ask me, never really deserved to gain any kind of traction that it did. From what I can tell, this one has almost entirely story-based connections with a little bit of overlapping abilities, so I can understand why some people may be inclined to call this basic, but I do think it has a really cool theme of defying fate that can make for a script that's really fun to listen to, and I think as far as the animation goes, the choreography and the set pieces are everything. It needs to look beautiful. I think that's like the main thing you gotta focus on, but then you can also have fun and go wild with the dialogue and the music that you implement in there. I think that would be the cherry on top for a really extravagant fight. It also seems decently debatable, maybe, in the sense that there's not as much of a general consensus as you can find with a lot of other matchups, and considering how difficult true debatability can be to find these days, I will take what I can get. We would also at least be getting some new Final Fantasy scaling, another character not from 7, which I want to see more of, and I think people know not to underestimate Final Fantasy characters, especially after Dante vs. Clive. And Shulk is one of those characters that I think definitely definitely deserve some kind of information expansion from Death Battle, because like Little Mac, who we talked about in the last episode, Shulk has gotten more popular thanks to Smash Bros, but not a lot of those people know what he's really about, and I think Death Battle could really help with that. And of course, this is a JRPG combo, which always fits well for this kind of format. I think this is just a really easy matchup for Death Battle to do well, as long as they put the right effort into it, of course. I think this matchup will get an episode eventually. It didn't do very great in the Tournament of Champions, so that's a little discouraging, but it still gets brought up all the time and would be the most natural Xenoblade introduction, and it is so perfect for Torian that there's a part of me that thinks that if he ever comes back, because he may come back occasionally, would they just put this one on hold for him? Would they be waiting to do this one for him? I honestly think it's possible, and that would be putting it in the best hands. And finally, Invincible versus Radiant Black, Image Comics versus Image Comics. I hope y'all liked Invincible Season 4, I know I sure did, or at least most of it. Invincible was actually in my most wanted new characters for Death Battle video that I made like a month ago, and in that video I said that I didn't really have a preferred for Mark, and that I could be flexible for some of his most popular opponents. And while I still consider that to be true, I think the main reason why that's true is because of the lesser likelihood of this matchup. Because if I'm being honest, I dig it. I dig it a ton. And for the record, I do not consider this to be a same series matchup. They may both technically exist in the wider Image multiverse or whatever, but I don't think that's a good reason to say why it shouldn't happen. I think that's just taking semantics too far for no reason, and that's kinda lame to me. And this one's very different from other Invincible matchups in that it's not really about the legacy or the heritage of the characters. It's a more zoomed in look at who they are as people, as heroes, those similarities. And I think more explicit character studies and finding the parallels there is in a lot of ways more interesting and could allow for better writing. It definitely has that Spider-Man inspiration of focusing on the human side of being a hero, which I love, as well as some other inspiration like Superman and Sentai respectively, which is a cool note. But yes, these characters are all about the hard truth of being a superhero. That it may sound cool, it may be the kind of thing that every kid wants to be, but it's not something that should be glorified all the time, and it needs to be taken seriously or else you will fail and people will get hurt. These characters do reach that status of being a great hero, but they needed to fail and take the time in order to get there. They need to learn a lot of things the hard way. I love that aspect of superhero writing, and that concept is what this matchup is at its core. But also from more of a straight production perspective, I think the animation has the potential for some great cosmic visuals, as well as having a pretty interesting fight dynamic. Because yes, these characters do fall into very similar hero archetypes, but their powers are very different from one another and could clash in pretty creative ways. It's also funny because it doesn't seem like a lot of people can agree on whether or not this fight is debatable, or even whose side it favors half the time, so I think this is definitely an instance of Radiant Black at least being severely under-researched, and it would be cool to see Death Battle shine some light on that series in this way. So no, I would not say this is my most wanted Invincible matchup. That would also be Gwen versus Eve, as I said earlier for Ben 10, but I think at this point I can say that this is still my default if I really had to pick a preferred for Mark himself. Maybe I'll find something later I like even more, but right now this feels very proper for him, and I think it could just be sick as hell. But as I alluded to earlier, despite how much I talked this one up, it is not gonna happen, at least not based on the popularity it has right now. It's a little annoying because sometimes it feels like the less popular the Invincible matchup is, the more I like it, so you know, that kind of sucks. I'm still hopeful that it won't be Gohan versus Invincible, but if it's not this one, then I'd probably want Invincible versus Hot Rod, or maybe Steven Universe, but I don't know what's gonna win out, I don't know what Death Battle's gonna choose. I just hope it's something that I at least like a little bit. And would you look at that, our time is up. Like I said before, check this video's description to read up on how matchups get selected for this series, or you can click the join button to submit directly for the Ballot Banter series. Comment any comments you have on these matchups, like this video and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this, but either way, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, and peace out.